Welcome to the Kriya Yoga Podcast, a source of inspiration and actionable education for those inspired towards the goal of enlightenment through yogic meditation. Through these interviews, discussions, and reflections, it is my intention to share the possibility of waking up to the reality of self and God realization, and to remind you of the immortal words of Paramahansa Yogananda. Don't look back. Don't look to the left or to the right. Look straight ahead to the goal and go all the way in this lifetime. I'm Ryan Kurczak, and I'll be your host on this adventure of spiritual self-discovery. Welcome, everybody. And now it's time for instruction in yoga practice. So, as Johnny was saying, this is the third year that we've had this, although it feels like the fourth year, because I think we were here in September the year before that for the Kriya Yoga Apprenticeship Program. And every year it's grown, and every year it's the highlight of my year, and I'm sure it's the highlight of many of you who've been here before. And our goal this week is to get a solid understanding of what it means to practice Kriya Yoga for the long term, for the duration of your life. I was reflecting upon this on the way over here. I was thinking about Mr. Davis, my Kriya Yoga teacher, and I realized, I've thought about this a lot, so I didn't just realize it, but I realized that he met Paramahansa Yogananda when he was 18 years old. He left his farm in Ohio, and he hitchhiked to California, and he met Paramahansa Yogananda on Christmas Eve, 1949. And from that point forward, he served as a Kriya Yogi, meditating on his own, becoming as realized as he could be. And he spent 70 years of his life in that role, writing, teaching, traveling. Essentially, as it was described to me the other day when I was down in Asheville, one of my, brother disciples, Michael Getch, he said the thing he appreciated most about Roy, aside from his intelligence, his devotion, his capacity to share wisdom, was that he was just like a drummer that just kept beating the drum year after year after year. And if people wanted to come and learn from him, if people wanted to go in the same direction that he was going, they were welcome to follow the beat of the drum. And he didn't dramatize it. He was just always there. He was always consistent. He was always present. And I was asked, I think last fall, a student asked me, how is it that you remained so devoted to the path, to Mr. Davis, and to the Kriya Yoga practices? And that struck me as an odd question, because I never thought to myself, how do I remain devoted to this path? Once I met Mr. Davis 25 years ago, I knew immediately that this is what I needed in my life. Now, I didn't come to this because I had a wonderful outpouring to love God. I came to it because I was always interested in other ways of seeing things. I was interested in philosophy, I was interested in psychology, and I wanted to know what the hell's going on. That's how I came to Kriya Yoga. Because I would look around and I would see how people behaved, and I would see society, and I would just see things, and I would think to myself, this is crazy. There has to be some other way. There has to be some way of understanding what this is all about. So I came to this path because it was my sense after I read Autobiography of a Yogi and after I met Mr. Davis that not only the Kriya Yoga practices themselves, but the philosophy provided a route to kind of satisfy all of my questions. When I studied philosophy, maybe some of you have done that too, especially Western philosophers, they take everything so far and then they get to a point where they say, well, I don't know, right? They just kind of take you so far, and then you get to the climax of it and it's just like, sorry, I don't know either. And the thing I appreciated about the whole yoga process is that it allows you to go beyond the mind. It allows you to go beyond all the thinking, all the wondering, all the confusion, all the doubt, and it allows you to kind of step into an experience of transcendence. Johnny was referring to Paramahansa Yogananda. He used the word deva in there. And oftentimes we call someone who we respect, who's a teacher, like a guru deva. And a guru, we know, is a teacher, but it's also a dispeller of darkness, a dispeller of ignorance. And deva, that's often translated as like a god or a goddess, but it can also be translated as angelic. And when we think of the idea of angels and angelic, there's a certain kind of set of ideas that come to our mind, but angelic really means to be full of light, to be full of clarity, and to be full of knowledge. And by knowledge, I don't mean book knowledge. I mean knowing something. In the same way that I know my hair is braided. No one has to tell me that. It's something that I know. I don't have to remind myself of it. And so the purpose of this whole process is ourselves to become like a deva, to become angelic, to become full of light. And the way we do that is to bring more light into our life. You may have noticed that when you think about certain things, you tend to see or experience that thing everywhere, right? When you are in an angry state of mind, you tend to see every reason that there is to be angry. When you're sad or depressed, everything is, oh, what's the point? And when you're happy, people can say and do whatever they want, and you're content, and you're peaceful, and all those troubles that were bothering you earlier don't bother you so much. And that's all because of where you're putting your attention. And the beautiful thing about yoga is it gives us a choice in regards to where we're putting our attention. And this is the hard part about the process, because oftentimes we are identified with the habit of our negativity, or we're identified with the habit of thinking, oh, I'm just a human being. I'm just subject to all this difficulty and all this suffering and all this sorrow. Well, we're all subject to that as long as we have a body. But the issue is that we actually have a choice inside to determine how we respond to the things that happen to this body, the things that happen to this mind, the things that happen within our experience. And I'd like to encourage you this week, as we go through learning techniques, as we talk about philosophy, really have an underlying theme, an underlying idea, a wondering of how can I make my life more sacred? How can I make my life more sacred? How can you give yourself permission to feel more sacredness within your life? About 6 weeks ago, Ishadas texted me, and he said he had a challenge for me. He said, usually when we do these presentations together, he said, you talk about jnana or wisdom or knowledge yoga, and I always talk about bhakti or devotion. So he said, what if we flip the script this time? What if you talk about bhakti, devotion, and I'll talk about jnana? So we're going to see how it goes, and I'm going to do my best. But ultimately, the way I feel about those two things is that really they're essentially the same thing. Why do I think they're the same thing? Because when I think about Mr. Davis, I knew him from the year 2000 until he passed. And that was, of course, the later part of his life. And I don't know what he was like before that. But I do know in the later part of his life, he was very direct. He didn't really waste time with words. He was very much what I would consider to be a wisdom-oriented or a jnana yogi type of person. However, how can you do something for 70 years without devotion? You know, how can you commit yourself to a path of study, of meditation, of teaching, if you weren't actually devoted to that thing? So when I think of Mr. Davis, to me, he's just a beacon of devotion, of quiet devotion. When I think about Swami Shri Yukteswar, often he was considered to be a jnani or a jnana yogi. And he was very stern, he was very strict, but he was that way because he wanted his students to see what reality was. He wanted his students to know what love was. In the Holy Science, I really need to memorize this because I talk about it a lot, and I never seem to have it just right. But there's a quote that he pulls out of the Bible where he essentially he says, "This is as if God is talking to you, or God is talking to a student or a disciple or a devotee." He says, I have seen how you have labored. I have seen how you have toiled. I have seen how you've experienced false prophets or false teachers, and I've seen what you have gone through, and I still love you. He says, but I only hold one thing against you, and that's that you left your first true love, right? And Sri Yukteswar quotes this because the whole purpose of yoga is to return to the experience of that one true love. And in order to do that, you have to be responsible. You have to approach it in an intelligent way. You have to know, in a sense, what your beloved loves, right? So if you love someone, don't you want to get to know them better? So you know what kind of flowers they like. So when you bring them a flower, they also feel that love. When you know someone, you know what kind of music they like. You know what kind of service they appreciate. You know what their love language is. So you have to learn about them. You have to have knowledge in order to be able to appropriately show and manifest love, right? So in my experience, the idea of devotion and the idea of bhakti and jnana and wisdom, they're actually the same. They're actually the same thing. Now, I'm not going to use that as an excuse to get out of the talk on bhakti, but that is my experience. And what's important about this path is to recognize that it is a lifelong path, and it is a lifelong path of learning, of change, of growth. When we were in Ireland last year for a retreat we were doing, about halfway through the week, someone said, well, isn't there a shortcut? And it occurred to me, this is the shortcut. You know, we have this vast universe. We have infinite divinity that we can learn. We can learn to experience. And what is one lifetime to do that? It's nothing compared to the millions and billions of years that things have existed. So this is the shortcut. And when Mr. Davis would often be asked, are you enlightened? And many of you know that's a trick question, right? Because if you say, I am enlightened, well then of course you're just egotistical. And if you say, I'm not enlightened, then why would I listen to you in the first place? But he had a wonderful response to that question. He said, all I know is I'm a little more awake each day. I'm a little more awake each day. And what I appreciated about Mr. Davis, well, one of the things I appreciated about Mr. Davis was his consistent dedication to growth and inner realization. He has probably published, I think, over 40 books in his lifetime. That's a lot of books. But there's only a handful of books that he actually felt was still valid. I remember when I was very enthusiastic and I was trying to help out his own ministry, someone gave me a copy of one of his first books called This is Reality, which was a commentary on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And if I recall, I think he wrote that book in 1969, so that would have been about 20 years after he had met Mr. Paramahansa Yogananda. And I got that book, and what I decided to do was I stuck it in front of my computer and I typed the whole thing out in a Word document, thinking that, oh, well now he'll have, you know, a modern version of the file and he can republish it if he wants to. So I didn't tell him what I was doing. I typed it all out and I sent it to him, and he said, well, that's okay. We don't need that. He says, that doesn't reflect my current understanding. And there are several books that he put out that he never really republished because as the years went on, his own understanding grew and changed. So to see that in a person, to me, that's also inspiring, because when you meet someone who thinks they know it all, you should be very careful. Because if they think they know it all, then in a way their capacity to be alive and dynamic has become arrested. They might know some very good things, some very specific things, but to think that they know it all, that's a dangerous state to be in. So as you go through this process, it's good to think of yourself as almost like a perennial student. As long as you are alive, as long as you have a body, as long as you can breathe, you have the capacity to keep learning, to keep growing, to keep discovering deeper and deeper aspects of divinity. And I found that in my life, I've been surrounded by people like that. When I go to the gym, I work out with this 70-year-old biker. He's covered in tattoos, he's kind of scary, but he's really a sweetheart. And I talk to him, and he's still always learning more about fitness. He's always telling me more about certain exercises, about certain supplements, about things that he tried 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the things they used to do and the things they do now. He's still learning. One of the musicians that I play with, she's 77. And she's been playing music her whole life. And she recently started taking violin lessons again. She's been playing violin her whole life. And she decided to start taking lessons again because she thought there's just maybe something more that she could learn, something more that she can know. And so being surrounded by these people, what I love about them is that there's no pretentiousness. There's just this energy, this quality of consistent realization. It's as if they're really alive, like a plant that just keeps growing, not a plant that's dried out and if you touch it, it breaks because it quit. It doesn't have life anymore. But they're like a plant that keeps growing and keeps changing and keeps evolving. Now, we don't want to become addicted to change and transformation because we know that that's a possibility too. Or do we have any astrologers in the room? No? Okay, one astrologer. Okay. Well, that's good. There's only a few. I'm an astrologer, and one of the things that I noticed in the astrological community is pretty much every astrological event is going to bring about change and transformation and a new rebirth, right? Well, that's really great to get clicks. And it's also kind of true, right? Because every day, every moment is actually a new you. So that makes the astrologers right most of the time. But we don't want to get caught up in change and transformation just simply for the sake of change and transformation. We want to be able to study, to learn, to apply what we learn, to make it a part of us. And then once it becomes solid, once that stage becomes noble to us, then we wonder, as Mr. Davis would say, well, what is beyond that? What is beyond even this? So when you consider your process in meditation, what you think it is right now, hopefully will not be what it actually is in 2 to 3 years from now. Hopefully the realizations that you think you want to have right now will not be what your realizations actually are 10 or 20 years from now. I remember when I first became interested in this, I wanted to know what is God? What is the divine? What is this infinite consciousness? That's what I wanted to know. And I had a sense of what it was, right? Now that sense of what it was is not actually what it is, but it gave me a direction to go in so I could figure it out for myself. So this is another part of the process that you have to be aware of. What you think it is probably not it. Because if that's what it was, you wouldn't be trying to figure it out, right? So you want to be willing to wonder, to use what you learn here this week, the philosophy that you study, the techniques that you learn. You want to have an idea of where you want to go, but then be open to see what it's really like. Okay. And this is going to be true across the board in life. For example, how many of you are married? How many of you have been married for more than 10 years? How many of you have been married for more than 20 years? 30? 40? 50? So we got one. I've heard that the first 50 years are the hardest. Is that right? Someone told me that. What's that?
And then it gets tough.
Yeah. I had a friend down in Asheville, and he had his 50th wedding anniversary, and on the 51st anniversary, he said to me, he's like, the first 50 years, they're the hardest. But the reason I bring that up is because do you think that when you first got married, right, what you thought marriage was going to be like when you first got married, was it actually what it was like once you've been married for 20, 30, 40, 50 years? Someone's laughing. Yeah. Usually it's not. And why is that? Because let's say you do get married when you're in your teens or your 20s or even your early 30s. what do you know then? How do you know how to be in a relationship with someone else? Do you really even know yourself, let alone do you have the capacity to know someone else? So in order to have a successful relationship, you have to be willing to learn more about yourself, and you also have to be willing to learn more about the person and how to live and grow together. And the same thing is true with the spiritual practice. In a way, you can think of it like you are a student, you are a devotee, you are a disciple. Disciple simply means student. And you have a relationship either with a guru, or you have a relationship with God, divinity, or a tradition. And a lot of the process is really learning, how do you fit into that? How does what are you, first of all, and how does that fit into the relationship with the guru? How does that fit into the relationship with the tradition? How do you fit into the relationship with God, the divine? Because if you come at your spiritual practice the same way most people come at relationships, meaning what am I going to get out of it, that's not going to be a sustainable relationship, right? So as you come into this process, absolutely you are going to benefit from meditating, you're going to benefit from studying, you're going to benefit from coming together in groups like this, you're going to benefit from spending time with your spiritual teacher, should you find one in a body. And you're going to benefit from all of that, and it's going to enlighten you, it's going to illuminate your life. But you have to remember that the other side of that is, what do you contribute to that? So when I talk about the Kriya Yoga lineage, yes, we can look at it as though the lineage of teachers, from teacher to student, but you have to remember you're part of that lineage too. The lineage is not just the individuals who are teaching, speaking. The lineage are the people who are practicing and manifesting and representing the tradition. So your life and your behavior is a representation of this tradition. And that is what is, in a sense, giving back to the tradition. And so the whole field, the field of me, you, of Roy, Mr. Davis, Paramahansa Yogananda, Sri Yukteswar, and so on, that is a field that persists through time. And when you remain engaged in that field by going through your practice, by remembering the teachings, by doing your best to live a wholesome life, then you are actually participating in a healthy spiritual relationship. And that is really what is supportive of you. Now, many of you might know, if you've listened to any of my talks, that I'm actually not a group person. I don't want people getting together in meditation groups and having coffee every Sunday and talking about their problems and so on. I want you at home, meditating, getting it done, and then going out into the world and letting your light shine. That's just me, okay? So don't think that, you actually have to listen to me in that regard. But you being by yourself, doing your practice on your own, that is still contributing to the wholeness of this field of the spiritual tradition, right? When I'm at home and I'm meditating, and I have these pictures, we have these pictures, Jasmine and I have them up on our mantle, and I have a huge picture of Roy that one student painted for me in my room where I do all my videos and podcasts, and I have an icon of Sri Yukteswar, and I have Anandamoy Ma over the door where I walk into the room where I do most of my work. I have books of Roy's, of Sri Yukteswar's, of Shivapuri Baba's. These things are all over the place, right? And every time I see them, every time I look at a picture, every time I remember the life of one of the teachers, I'm participating in that field. And this brings more light into your life. This brings more sacredness into your life. So that's one way to do it. We began this talk with a little prayer. Now that is an altered version of a prayer that I learned from Swami, which we initially learned in Italian, but we couldn't quite figure it out, so we had it translated to English. But what I found is that little prayer, receive, Lord, and I'll say the food part, receive, Lord, in thy light this food, for it is thine, infuse it with thy love, thy energy, and thy divine life. Well, you can do that over your food. You can do it in a gathering like this. If there's someone you love, you can say, receive, Lord, in thy light this person, infuse them with thy love, thy energy, and thy divine life. Before you go to work, receive, Lord, in thy light this work that I'm about to do, infuse it with your, and so on, right? You can use that prayer, and if you use it consistently, every little thing you do becomes illuminated. And when everything becomes illuminated, you start to see things more clearly. You become more attuned to what you could call the radiant field, as Mr. Davis would say, or the radiant field of spirit. And when you start to have that permeate your life, all of your decisions become aligned with a higher power. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to be successful all the time. It doesn't mean that things aren't going to go wrong. But it means that no matter what happens, that experience is aligned with a higher power. And in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, there are 3 pillars of Kriya Yoga. Tapas, which can loosely be translated as your spiritual practice. Svadhyaya, which is study of scriptures or study of yourself. And then Ishvara Pranidhana, which again can loosely be translated as surrender to God. And the interesting thing about Ishvara Pranidhana is that's said to be the fastest way to spiritual realization, surrender to God, the fastest way to spiritual realization and inner growth. In the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali goes through what is a state of oneness, what is a state of pure being. He gives all these ways of exploring it, of experiencing it. But he says, essentially, the fast track to doing that is through surrender to the divine. Now, surrender to the divine, you can intellectualize that. And you can just tell yourself all the time, well, I'm surrendered. I surrender this to the divine, and so on. You can get in your head and you can kind of turn it into a mental game. And that's okay, because that's a good first step, because you're starting to spiritualize your thoughts in a way. But the reason that's troublesome and sometimes difficult is because let's say you spend 10 years doing that, and on the 11th year you look around and you still don't feel like you've surrendered in God and that God is anywhere to be found, right? Well, eventually you get frustrated and you just give up. You think this whole surrender to God thing isn't all it's cracked up to be, and who knows, why did Patanjali even mention this? So we have to remember that we can use our minds in that way, but the purpose of Kriya Yoga is to actually give you a direct experience of what it's like to know God, divinity, and to feel a sense of this infinite consciousness expressing through you. Because when you catch glimpses of it, you actually see it, you actually feel it. You're not just telling yourself, you're not just saying, my hair is braided. Oh, yep, sure is. You're not just telling yourself that, you know it. Well, then surrender to God becomes easy. And so what we're aiming to do is to make our life as sacred as possible, so that as that light shows up for us, we catch a glimpse of it, we see it, we're not playing mind games with ourselves, and we can catch it, we can remember it, we can acknowledge it, and then that starts to kind of come together to where there's one flash of light, and then maybe a year later another flash of light, and then maybe 6 months later another flash, and they keep getting spaced out in your meditation or other places until eventually it's like every other day you catch a little flash here and there. And then as that goes on, maybe a couple times a day you catch a little flash. And then as that goes on, eventually it persists longer and longer. And when you start to feel a greater sense of light and connection more consistently, you are less likely to forget that it is true. How many of you, when you're feeling good, of course you think God is real and a part of your life, right? How many of you feel that way, all right? How many of you, when you're absolutely depressed and things have not been going well, you can't remember it at all? Anyone have that issue? I know I had that issue. I know. I've talked to my counselor about this. I said, why is it, why can't I remember during those times when I'm just bottomed out that there is this sense of support and divinity? Because I sure as heck feel it other times. Why is that? Well, it's habit. It's habit. And as the years go on, eventually the situation reverses itself to where even in the difficulties, even in the times when you're just bottomed out and depressed, you know that it's just a cloud passing through your awareness. You know that it's just a moment that's going to go on, right? And one of the best ways, aside from a deep spiritual practice, to get a sense of that is just pay attention to how you think and feel over the next 2 weeks. Sometimes you're going to feel great. Sometimes you're not going to feel great. But it's always going to change. It's always going to keep cycling through. And the more you're able to be aware of that and to see that, eventually you start taking the difficulties so seriously. Because just wait a minute, the weather is going to change. And the more that you see that happening, the more even-minded you become, the more calm you become, the more trusting you become in the wholeness of life, and the more that builds, again, this light, the sacredness grows. And it becomes easier to meditate then. It becomes easier to understand spiritual literature. It becomes easier to listen to lectures of your spiritual role models or spiritual teachers and understand what they're talking about. And that's because this world that you're experiencing right now, the nature of it is change. It's always changing. If you can't see that, that's your first step, is to recognize that the world is changing. But there's one thing that is not changing, and that is you as spirit, as the witness, as the observer, as a presence. The trouble is that which doesn't change, that infinite self of you, you can't see it. You can't touch it. You can't taste it. You can't give any kind of characteristics to it, because it is what you are, right? It is what you are. Anything else is part of nature, is part of the world. And that's why in yoga philosophy, maybe you've heard the chant spirit and nature dancing together. Maybe we'll hear it sometime. It's one of my favorites this week. But there's spirit and there's nature, and they're both eternal. They're both eternal. And part of what we're aiming to realize in this whole process is that eternal nature of ourself, but also to have the ability to acknowledge the ever-changing experience of nature. In Sanskrit, nature is called prakriti. And the soul, or the spirit, or the undefinable you, is called Purusha. So we have Prakriti and Purusha. And the goal of the yogi, as described in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, is to develop unceasing discrimination between those two things. Unceasing discrimination between Prakriti and Purusha, in between nature and spirit. And the interesting thing about it is, which you might have to wrestle with, but hopefully will be inspiring, is that nature, Prakriti, the ever-changing experience, which is also, in a sense, the goddess, the divine feminine, exists solely for your own illumination as spirit. Okay? So that means that this whole play of everything that changes, everything that comes and goes, all the sorrows, all the joys, you can see it, even your thoughts. So if you can think something, that means you can see it. If you can say, I love cookies, well, you are aware of that thought within your mind, which means you as the soul can experience it. So even your thoughts are part of nature. So it goes subtle. It's not just the chair, it's not just the book, it's you as a subtle being as well. But everything that you can experience exists solely for your own illumination, your own spiritual illumination. Now, again, we're not going to get into the philosophy of why do all these horrible things happen and so on, because that can go on forever and no one has ever been able to efficiently answer that question. But I'm telling you that everything that happens within your life is divine. We'll just say Divine Mother, just to keep it simple. Divine Mother providing an experience for you, saying, hey, look back to your first true love. Remember that. That's the important thing. And why is that the case? Well, it's definitely hard to swallow in certain situations, but if you are only eternal, immortal spirit, if that's what you are, if you are one with divinity, if you are one with Ishvara and so on, then that means to define yourself by anything else, to define yourself as anything else is really kind of blasphemy, right? You love your spouse, you love your children, you love your job, you love this planet, you love the butterflies, you love the trees, you love the oceans, you love having a healthy body. But if you define yourself by any of those things as solely that is you, then when it leaves, when it's over, when it changes, what are you left with? sorrow, despair, grief. And that's not what you are, right? That's not what you are. So when we see yogis and they seem austere and they seem aloof, it's not because they're cold, it's not because they can't appreciate life, it's because they know what they're not, right? They know what they're not, and then they also know what they are. And so the whole purpose of yoga, in a way, is to figure this out, to learn this.